one analyst was saying, and it's a guy at I think he's called Matthew Bell at Canalis. Is it Canalis or Canalis?
I think they pronounce
Canalis, was saying that by sort of divesting this business, in theory, they could use that as a supplier of x86 chips. Yeah,
right.
So the server chip business becomes a separate entity owned by somebody else, isn't subject to US sanctions anymore in the same way Honor isn't. Gets its x86 chips from the people it needs, and then
sells them on,
and then sells them on to Huawei.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. My voice is apparently a bit deeper today because I was out on the lash last night with my bro and some of his colleagues. So I've got a sort of Barry White thing going. I'm not feeling that well rested, but it's amazing what a bit of Hazy Jane does to
on top of ginseng.
On top of my, I went to the co-op intending to get a Red Bull, perked myself up, didn't have any, so I ended up having to get this sort of thing with ginseng in it, which apparently perks you up. I don't know.
Ginger's supposed to be good for you, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll let you and the audience be the judge.
Yeah.
Yes, no guest this week. In fact, we haven't got any lined up explicitly for the rest of the week. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. We had a good run.
We did have a good run.
Yeah.
Isn't there a possibility of well, maybe I shouldn't preempt it by mentioning the company that is talking about?
Oh, there was. Yeah, there was. Well, I haven't heard.
Makes equipment. It's quite big.
I haven't heard anything
through our mutual contact.
I'm actually not sure what you're going on about, if I'm honest.
Well, there was a possibility of getting someone from Nokia on, wasn't there? Might as well just say it. It's not.
Exactly right. Oh yes, that's true. I've forgotten about that.
Yeah, which sounds like
might still happen. Yeah, we just got to have someone
quite senior as well.
Yeah, well that'd be good, and then maybe that'll set a precedent. Then maybe Ericsson chuck someone on, berate us for taking a piss out of a Swedish accent. If I get Sweden on, I can't be going, hello, welcome to the podcast. That would be a bit insulting to their face, wouldn't it? I don't know what a Finnish accent. We'll have to ask Way what a Finnish accent is.
Yeah, we could get him to do it.
There we go. Anyway, better not witter for too long. Last week was an epic preliminary witter, wasn't it?
It was.
Just one other little incidental I want to mention is I was on someone else's podcast yesterday. Oh. I was interviewed by Babel PR. Mm-hmm. They do a podcast thing, so it's quite novel being on the guest side of it.
Yep.
So thanks a lot for that, Babel. Look forward to hearing that when it comes out. Don't think I said anything too career threatening. They were just asking me about industry stuff, journalisty stuff. I got to moan about sort of incoherent and fallacious trolls a little bit more.
Yep.
I've got one guy's he's been hassling me this week. It's quite fun. Just saying, you need to do more of this and less of that. And I go, cheers, mate. Thanks for the tip.
On any particular story, or
no? He just don't like my attitude. Thinks I need to straighten up my ideas. And I'm just like, right, okay. Well, I'm not going to. So bye. So yes, that's that. But let's crack on because Pierre's got to go and do grown-upness of some sort, don't you? What are we going to chat about this week? Right at the end of last week, we mentioned Huawei's latest quarter sort of as the very last thing. We only gave it about a couple of minutes. And then I wrote it up on the Monday. Monday morning's always an interesting time, and sometimes you have to be creative if there hasn't been anything particularly exciting happening over the weekend. And I thought, I'm going to write it up anyway, even though I was late to the game, because I thought it was interesting. And I combined it with tracking the quarterly smartphone shipment numbers. So that's our most read story of the week. So we're going to lead with that. And you've been writing some Huawei stuff as well. Then I think we're going to talk about fibre. Again, there've been a few little bits of news coming out of quarterlies. We have like sort of BT, Virgin.
There's a good segue actually from Huawei into fibre.
Yes, well, quite, especially with your coverage of Huawei this week. So we're going to talk about that news, and I think just talk more generally about the state of fibre right now in terms of investment, rollout, all that sort of thing. And then we're going to conclude with a bit of it's not a quirky, but it's a bit of an odd story that I think I just wrote up today, and I think Light Reading covered yesterday. about C-band in the US, which is like a mid-band spectrum that's auctioned at great expense earlier at the start of this year. Now they're suddenly worried that 5G over C-band is going to mess with like the safety systems of airplanes.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about, why is that even a thing? Why is that just coming up now?
I know.
So those are the three things we're going to chat about.
I smell a rat.
Yeah, well, quite. So those are three things we're going to chat about. And just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook/Meta, I'm not going to call it Meta, all right?
No one's ever going to call it Meta.
But it's not on Meta. It's on Facebook.
That's true. Yeah, because Meta's the holding.
It's like Alphabet.
No one says Alphabet.
No.
Yeah.
Anyway,
it's on YouTube. No, yeah. Anyway.
If you're watching it on any of those things, then you can also listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. Okay, Huawei.
Need to go back to doing your Barry White voice.
Yeah. So, Huawei.
It sounds good with Huawei.
Welcome to the midnight shift.
Bringing you Huawei till the small hours.
And last week you did the opposite. You were like, Ericsson did jolly good. Like,
Did you like my old school English commentator?
It's very legit. Yeah.
They're obviously having a mare, thanks almost entirely to the American government victimizing them. And I still maintain, we say it each time it comes up, if Huawei and the Chinese state are in league with each other and they have been up to no good, then they deserve the repercussions of it, but we still haven't seen much hard evidence that they're doing that. And sometimes you get a feeling that they're just guilty of being Chinese. And what bothers me about that isn't anything specific to Huawei or any other company. It's just due process. Everyone's entitled to due process, no matter what country they're from, and no matter what political agenda is being served. Anyway, that said,
it's also very inconsistent, the whole application of this sort of, they've gone hard on Huawei, but other companies, it's sort of, this is it was kind of on the record, so I can say it. But when I was talking to Ericsson's CEO a few weeks ago, and he was chatting about this geopolitical crisis, he was pointing out that, the Swedish government buys cars from Volvo, which is owned by a Chinese company now,
right?
And then we're talking about technology going into cars all the time, aren't we? In fact, that's one of Huawei's pivots is to make software for cars. So. Where do you draw the line?
You're right. It's completely incoherent. And as I've always said, if we've got a problem with Chinese technology being used as a backdoor into, as a security backdoor, then why are we happy to have Lenovo servers?
Yeah, exactly. And I know there's people actually pushing because they have this. I didn't realise there's a list called the coordinated list or something, or the covered list. There's the entity list, which is the list that means you can't buy stuff, I think, from like American firms. There's also this thing called the covered list, I think it's called,
right,
which is companies that that are deemed big security threats and that shouldn't sell stuff into the US, basically. So it's got companies like Huawei and ZTE are both on that.
Yeah.
Hence this effort to try and rip out the networks that they have deployed. But there are senators pushing for companies like Lenovo to be added to that list.
Yeah.
And you think, I looked at how much Lenovo makes in the sort of Americas from sales, and it's massive. I mean, it's as you'd expect. It's laptops and IT equipment. If they went after Lenovo that way and they had something like they've done to, like they're trying to do to sort of Huawei and strip out equipment, so basically stop Lenovo from selling stuff in North America, you can't. It's impossible to see that there wouldn't be some kind of retaliation by the Chinese.
Yeah.
And the obvious thing for them to do is something like an equivalent would be Apple.
Yeah.
And imagine what sort of world we get into then if they start saying Apple can't sell products here anymore. I mean, that's really sort of ramping up the stakes to quite a.
It's the most valuable
level.
Company. Well, actually, second after Microsoft.
And their sales in China are big. Apple, again, I can't remember what they are, but I'm looking at them. It's a big chunk of sales. It's
especially after the Huawei smartphone.
Yeah.
In fact, I think I can tell you that, because from the story that I'm referring to that we wrote, which is our most read story this week. These days, I'm usually getting my smartphone numbers from Counterpoint. Because they're nice and prompt, and it was also founded by a chap who used to be a colleague of mine at Strategy Analytics.
Yeah.
called Tom Kang and another chap called Neil Shah. They were both on my team when I went there. So I know they're good guys. And, just to emphasise, any numbers you get, whether it's Strategy Analytics, Counterpoint, Gartner, IDC or whatever, these are estimates. They're positioned as hard numbers, but they're not. No one has access to hard numbers. You can have hard numbers. For example, when Apple was publishing its shipments,
and they stopped doing that, didn't they?
Yeah, they stopped doing that. But
do the others generally all publish their shipment figures? Is it just
no? They
Apple
don't.
They don't
It's dropped
anymore?
off.
So Apple started a trend of not publishing your shipment figures, and it's all become more secretive since they started doing that.
Well, no, actually, Apple was one of the few that was more transparent.
Right.
So we used to do an absurd thing when I was at SA. My boss at the time, and I think Tom, when he was there, the guy who went and founded Counterpoint, and Tom's Korean, and he had a good relationship with Samsung, and they used to have to play this silly little guessing game with Samsung. They wouldn't just give them the numbers, even as a confidential.
So it's sort of be like,
thing.
is it higher than 50? But is it lower than 100 sort of thing?
It's like play your fucking cards right. I expected Bruce Forsyth to go higher when they were doing it. So different people are cagey in different ways. I mean, I think we used to sometimes wonder if we got numbers from some Chinese vendors, whether or not they might have padded them out a little bit.
Yeah.
But certainly when Apple was publishing them to the world, that was just taken as gospel. You wouldn't second guess that. Why was I going on about that? Oh yeah, you were asking about Apple in China. So yes. So Counterpoint's got its estimates. I'm sure they're fairly accurate, but that's why you get different numbers from different analyst houses, because they're all having a bit of a punt.
But they're all showing Huawei going down, aren't they?
They are. Well, I'll come to the global ones in a sec, but just Counterpoint's numbers for China, they're just offering market share, not outright numbers. Huawei's share of the Chinese smartphone market in Q3 2020 was 30%. In Q3 21, it's 8%.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty.
And
bad.
the growth is minus 77% year on year. And minus 18% quarter on quarter.
And the revenue numbers back it up, because they've been quite alarmist, Huawei themselves, actually, on calls about what's happening with the smartphone business. They were saying I think their devices business is maybe 70 billion or something, ridiculous, what they derive.
Right.
But they get about 50 billion from smartphones. And they were saying that about 30 to 40 billion of that is going to disappear this year.
Yeah, well, so let's have a look. So the story I wrote was Huawei consumer business continues to tank.
Yeah.
And it was based on, the same stuff that we were talking about at the end of the pod last week, and I just expanded on it, and then also looked at global shipment numbers, smartphone shipment numbers. And if you look at Huawei's there, so for example, in Q3 19, Huawei globally shipped 66.7 million. In Q3 20, they still managed 50.9 million. Q3 21, 5.8 million.
Wow. I mean, that implies the figures could be even worse than this.
Well, exactly. I mean, there's no, especially when you consider it can't even count on China right now.
Yeah.
And there's lots of reasons why it can't count on China, but basically primarily because it's got extra constraints on its access to semiconductors because of the US activity.
Yeah.
And it doesn't get proper Android. So I've been writing this for years. When they were trying to talk...
You called it out originally, I remember. You were saying without Android, they're going to die.
Yeah, there's just no way.
You were spot on about that.
Oh, well, you call it full fat.
Yeah, full fat Android.
Android.
There's just no way. And one of the reasons I was able to be so strident about it is I've seen other companies like Amazon try and do forked versions of Android. And what happens, the way Google controls Android, even though it's open source and anyone can get hold of the kernel and the core code, the way they control it is through the Play Store.
Yeah.
So if you don't play ball according to what Google says, then you don't get the Play Store. And what's the fucking point?
Yeah.
In having a smartphone if you haven't got access to the
I've
App
seen it
Store.
happen in practice, because my own mum insisted on having a Huawei phone.
Right.
Because she'd had a previous one that was good, and she was due an upgrade, and the old one was causing problems. And I said, look, it could lead to issues because of all of this stuff's going on, which she wasn't really aware of. She went and got it anyway, and Play just stopped working, basically.
Right.
It just
it
wasn't usable, and it became impossible to actually... And then other things just weren't working with the phone. It just became a sort of buggy device.
Quite.
And
Yeah, because
EE
you
was
don't have
good
the
enough to
support.
swap it.
You don't have the constant patching and
Yeah.
and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So you get to say, "I told you so."
But the provider, which is EE, was good enough to swap it.
Oh, they
Yeah,
were good
yeah,
for
so
them.
that, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, fair play to you. Get a bit of free kudos for you there. So I just rent their consumer business is going down the toilet, and it's not. They saying it themselves. I think their quote from their rotating chairman. Once he managed to sort of sit still, and stop swiveling his chair around like a nutter. He said overall performance. Do you know what would be funny? So if you're reading it out, you'd sort of read it out like he only comes to the mic every now and then, like overall performance, because he's rotating so much. Anyway, overall performance was in line with forecast.
No, I want you to do that.
No, I can't keep doing that. I'll make myself sick. Yeah, overall performance in line with forecast, said a dizzy Guo Ping. While our B2C business has been significantly impacted, our B2B businesses remain stable. And then just generally, thanks for bearing with us. We'll get there in the end. Sort of veiled shaking of fist at the US without explicitly saying it. So it was in line with forecast, and he says our B2C business has been significantly impacted. And, as we said last year, their revenue, the 9 months, including Q3, their revenues were down 32% year on year.
Yeah.
Now, I think you've said that it was, at its peak, it was about 50-50 B2C and B2B, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if nearly all of...
There's I think it's 50 device, B2C, and then the other 50% is a mix of network and enterprise. But the enterprise is quite small, so mainly networks.
So it's probably about...
40-10, let's say that bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Like a third networks and a sixth enterprise, something like that. So if it's dropped 32%, and that's nearly all consumer, and consumer's 50% of it, that basically means that consumer's probably dropped by 60-70%, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And then when you look at the numbers, the smartphone numbers that I just read out a minute ago, it stands to reason. If their global smartphone shipments are down 90% versus a couple of years ago, then that's going to be it. I mean, I would have thought nearly all of their consumer revenue is smartphones.
Most of it. I think they do tablets, don't they? And they do
and
some other
devices. They'll do some smartwatches.
They do some wearables. I don't know if they do laptops, but I'm not aware of that. But they might do.
So I mean, it's hard to know what more to say, especially as we've already covered the Chinese side of it. I mean, the only thing I'll say before sort of asking you for other comment and inviting you to talk about any other sort of Huawei angles you've got. I'll just read out my concluding paragraph. I said, with the global semiconductor shortage showing no signs of letting up, nor sparing anyone its ravages, and that includes Apple. I think I hyperlinked to a Wall Street Journal story about Apple there. Huawei might reflect that there are worse times to be out of the devices market, which is fair enough. I'm sure that's poor consolation, but there is that. But then I said, but networking equipment needs chips too, and Huawei's stockpiles can't be infinite. There doesn't seem to be too much decline left on the consumer side for Huawei. If we take those smartphone things, they've only got 6 million more shipments to lose.
Yeah.
So if overall revenues keep declining at this rate, we'll have to assume the networking business is the cause, was my assumption.
Yeah.
Or the enterprise.
I mean, enterprise is where they've staked their...
their pivot.
Yeah, exactly. And clearly that's really small. I mean, it's always been small in the annual report. It might not even be, 10%, 20%. It's certainly tiny compared with the consumer and networks. And, where does that come from? I mean, they've been talking this up in recent meetings with analysts and conferences they've had. It's all to do with doing software for cars. That's one area they're trying to expand into, and they've talked about developing software tools that you can use for enterprise 5G applications. And then the cloud's another big one, moving into the cloud and providing public cloud service. They're competing against, I mean, it wouldn't be so much AWS and Microsoft in the domestic market. It'd be Alibaba, and Tencent and those kinds of guys. But I mean, that in itself is not an easy market for them to expand in. And I think one of the problems there is the big public cloud companies, you know, the Amazons, the Microsofts, the Googles of this world, they have, how do they provide those cloud services? They have these big data centers, don't they, filled with equipment supplied by the likes of Dell and Hewlett-Packard running x86 processors, which is something that, you know, and this was reported this week apparently by Bloomberg. I think got the story first. They've had this server business, Huawei, that has bought, you know, traditionally bought sort of x86 processors from Intel,
Yep.
which they would presumably need if they're going to be a big player in the public cloud.
Yeah.
And they've sold it, you know. So it's pretty much what happened with. It's not been confirmed by Huawei, I should say.
Okay.
They weren't commenting.
This is a scoop.
It's a scoop. But if it's true, and it sounds plausible, it's very much a similar thing to what happened with Honor, isn't it?
And Honor's doing well, by the way.
Honor's doing well. You know, it's getting rid of a business. So, you know, the big issue with Honor was, you know, the big issue with smartphones generally, as you've just sort of talked about, is not being able to get the components they need to produce high-end smartphones, especially the stuff they get from TSMC in Taiwan. And so by selling Honor, and everybody's going to question what are the links that Huawei still has with that company.
Totally.
No one really knows who owns Honor now, except that
the bloke who's in charge of Honor was the Huawei guy who was in charge of it when he was at Huawei.
There you are. And there's a government buyer involved as well, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a lot of government money involved.
I don't think sounds very good with this whole argument, we don't have anything to do with the Chinese government, and then all of a sudden the Chinese... Now, the story about these
But the fact that they've been able to circumvent the US embargo just by that fairly clumsy manoeuvre.
This is the stupid thing about the US embargoes, that Honor's flying in China now. Well, basically, a lot of the stuff that...
Counterpoint's numbers have it up quarter on quarter, 96%.
Yeah. And they're not on any entity list or anything. They can go ahead and get presumably anything they want, which is why they're doing so well and why they can still provide 5G on their phone, something Huawei can't apparently do anymore. And it sounds
Third in the Chinese market.
It sounds like this server sale is a similar sort of thing.
Right.
They couldn't get the chips they need from Intel, so they've sold it. Now, the Bloomberg story, the buyers are not really known, but one's apparently a government affiliated company, you know, and I talked to a couple of analysts and they were saying, well, you know, one of the issues about this server business and getting these x86 chips is that, as I say, if they're going to be a big player in the cloud, they would need those processors, and it's pretty hard to get them from anywhere else, as you know. You know, Intel's. You look at. I think I looked at some data from S&P Global Intelligence. He was saying that, and we talked about Intel's dominance in this area lots, haven't we? But their share of the market for sort of those x86 processors that go into data centers is something like 90%, 95%.
Well, they've only got
There's only really AMD, and AMD uses the same architecture, and even in its own SEC filings, complains about the fact that it's pretty much dependent on Intel.
The whole reason, if I got my history right, the whole reason AMD exists is because for antitrust grounds, Intel was forced to give an x86 license to one competitor, and that was AMD. Yeah, and then they spent the rest of their time
AMD
doing dirty tricks to try and keep...
wouldn't be able to supply...
Sorry, Intel lawyers. Maybe that was in the past and maybe you didn't do it at all. But that's what I read.
But they presumably wouldn't be able to supply Huawei either, would they, AMD? It's not as though it'd be any
AMD's
easier.
On a bit of a tear. It's doing well. But yeah, in terms of scale... AMD doesn't have its own fabs. Funnily enough, what used to be AMD's fabs, which is now called Global Foundries, just IPO'd.
Yeah.
But they don't have their own fabs because that became Global Foundries, whereas Intel does. So in terms of security of supply for server chips, Intel is the only game in town.
And therefore, one analyst was saying, and it's a guy at, I think he's called Matthew Bell at Canalys. Is it Canalys or Canalys?
I think they pronounce
Canalys, was saying that by sort of divesting this business, in theory, they could use that as a supplier of x86 chips, yeah? Right. So the server chip business becomes a separate entity owned by somebody else, isn't subject to US sanctions anymore, in the same way Honor isn't, gets its x86 chips from the people it needs, and then
sells them on.
And then sells them on to Huawei.
Then you'd have a similar thing to what the Yanks tried to get Meng on, which is sort of shell companies to circumvent embargoes or that sort of thing. You know, would this new, let's call it let's call it not at all Huawei server company.
Yeah.
Would this not at all Huawei company still be subject to these US rules, such that if it's sold to Huawei, it would then be punished itself?
Well, possibly, because I guess that's the issue with TSMC, isn't it? It's not an American company, but it uses American tools and technology. Therefore, it's not able to supply those because it goes into the US bad books if that happens.
Yeah, the Americans are so powerful; they'll find a way.
But TSMC is also not a Chinese company, so they might be less. They might be more worried about the impact of US sanctions in the same way that Samsung is than a Chinese company, for instance.
I would say so.
And if this Chinese company, and now the Americans might figure out what's happening, and I said this when I covered it, that they might even decide to put Honor on the entity list at some point. But there's a lot of inconsistencies with the entity list. I mean, the fact that ZTE is not on the entity list, I find quite bizarre. I mean, maybe it's just that the Americans don't think it's that much of a worry anymore because it's not really in a lot of Western markets, is it? It's not. It never had the presence that Huawei did. I mean, maybe that's the issue for the Americans with ZTE. When it did go onto the entity list, it had nothing to do with security. It was all about doing dodgy deals in Iran.
Yeah, embargo busting
and maybe
stuff.
they were never really that worried because it's never had a massive presence outside China and Africa and some other sort of emerging markets. I think you're giving them too much
credit for even being that coherent.
But it seems very inconsistent to me.
Yeah.
But the cloud business, ignoring all of that and looking at this cloud business that Huawei's got, where they're very secretive, they don't reveal much about it. They don't say what the numbers are. I've asked them several times now if I could speak to somebody about the cloud business and get some more information. They've never set up an interview. They've never done. They're actually worse than they've ever been, I think.
Yeah.
Huawei, in terms of, not divulging things and not wanting to put. They went through this phase when all the shit was happening with Trump, when they actually became quite open and they were like, this is how we're going to try and deal with things. And there were lots of press conferences, I remember, that journalists got pulled into, and they've actually gone away from that. I think
almost
now.
Like they've thrown in the towel.
It's almost like they've thought, well, sod it. We're going to sort of. I mean, maybe at the time they entertained notions of being able to get around some of the sanctions more easily than they've been able to, and they've realised it's not that easy, and they don't want to say what the plan B is, but because there isn't one.
Made the very sensible move of withdrawing a lot of budget from areas where they're being persecuted.
But the cloud business is so this is the thing. You look at your Counterpoint data, and Canalys and another company called Synergy Research Group, which is very much focused on the cloud, public cloud. They do this sort of regular thing about public cloud shares. One of the interesting things from that is you can see how dominant AWS, Microsoft and Google are. They're sort of 2/3 of the market, and then everything else is quite fragmented. I think the next biggest one's probably Alibaba. You've got people like IBM and Oracle in there. Their estimate of Huawei's market share. So Huawei's been going on about how it's the fastest growing cloud provider in the Asia Pacific at the moment, and it's number 2 in China. Synergy's figure, their estimate for their entire global market share of cloud infrastructure is 1%.
Right.
Now, so they reckon 45 billion was spent on cloud infrastructure services in the last quarter. It's a big market, obviously, with those hyperscalers in it.
So you're saying they get $500 million.
You're talking 45 billion.
But their share.
So 450 million, let's say, they've got, which is, if you look at it as a percentage of, you were talking about Huawei sales going down that much in the last quarter, as a percentage of their overall sales, it would make cloud about 2%.
Right.
So it's for a company that size, it's negligible. It's not going to save them. So, and then the other thing that's happening is, the network stuff, where we've had this perception that it's been quite flattish, and I think even last time when they did sort of break things down, it was gone down a little bit, but it wasn't like this big sort of drop. I think the reason for that is just the swap out times in networks are much longer, aren't they? You have this sort of replacement cycle that happens with handsets. It becomes quite apparent
soon.
It's
just not so volatile.
It's not as volatile. It's a slower. I mean, you put equipment in and it can stay there for years. Yeah. Whereas people change their phones all the time, an upgrade comes out, they go and buy them, so it becomes apparent quite quickly. But if you talk to people in the know about access to TSMC chips and the network stuff, and just basically the impact of sanctions, and they all say it will hurt them.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of time, and they did a lot of stockpiling, and maybe they can still feed off some of that. But it will hurt them.
That's
and at the same time, you've got this pushback anyway, because the US went around under Trump sort of telling people not to use Huawei because otherwise they were going to not sell you jets, and you're going to be in trouble with the Americans if you did. And I think that's one of the reasons why the UK was so was so sort of quick to change its mind about allowing Huawei in.
Well, and they
wasn't it?
threatened us over things like intelligence sharing and stuff as well.
Exactly.
Didn't
And
they've really been throwing their weight around about this.
yeah, and a lot of it's been focused on mobile. Obviously, 5G's been the big story. Don't use Huawei in your 5G networks. We've talked about this a few times on the pod before. What's happening in other areas, optical and fixed, where it's actually been the biggest provider. It's been a massive provider in those markets. And one thing that's become apparent to me in the last couple of weeks, and this is what the story I wrote on Europe, is that it now looks like that replacement of Huawei broadband equipment in Europe is starting to happen. I think it's going to play out over a much longer time.
So take that one from the top. Your assertion in your story, I haven't read that story, I'm afraid, but I'm aware that you wrote it. Is that you're actually starting to see data points that point to, even though we haven't had explicit bans of Huawei in fixed networks.
The only country that's had an explicit restriction is the UK that I'm aware of, where they've said you have to be down at 35% of a fibre broadband network by 2023, and then it's been left hanging. What do we do about it after that?
Yeah.
And the reason that the UK government didn't sort of come in and be as restrictive as it has been in 5G is basically because there aren't the alternatives. We talk about the mobile market being controlled by just a few vendors, and your only options really are Nokia and Ericsson if you get rid of Huawei. In broadband, it's even worse. You've literally got Nokia, next biggest player I think ZTE, so that's no good. Then Fibre Home, which is also Chinese, so that's no good. And the next two biggest players are Calix and Adtran. Well, their market shares are less than 5% each, or have been last year. So you're talking. So this is when the the National Cybersecurity Centre actually came out with an explicit statement. There's no other scale vendors in the market. So basically, if you ban Huawei, you're leaving companies like BT. You're kind of leaving them hanging in a way. Yeah. What do?
Yeah,
they're going to be solely dependent on Nokia, was the implication.
But the flip side of that is, even if there aren't explicit bans, if I'm the CTO or the CEO of a telco, and I'm planning some major investment or just a continuation of current investment, and I think there's any possibility that a swap out's going to be imposed on me, I'm probably just going to want to get ahead of the game and just go, fuck it, I'm just not going to touch it.
And that's what's happening. You can now see that happening. So it's happened clearly in the UK, where BT's brought in Adtran as this third vendor, and it's now very, very likely, I think, that Adtran and Nokia will be the two companies that are responsible for most of the rest of Openreach's fibre build-out. When we were at the Broadband World Forum in Amsterdam, this is a question that Pierre and I specifically asked Howard Watson when we were chatting with him, and he was saying he wants to be able to keep Huawei there till 2031, 2032. But he didn't say. It was interesting, that there was a finite point, and it's quite a long way away, obviously, another decade, because he said that would give them a chance to sort of depreciate the equipment.
Yes.
But it's still obviously they're thinking there's going to be a point when we need to get Huawei out, yeah? And you look at, there was a couple of really interesting analyst notes that came out this week about Adtran's progress in Europe, saying that it's picking up a lot of these sort of replacement deals, the analysts put it.
Not a bad time to be Ronan Kelly.
Exactly. So they themselves on their own earnings call were saying they've got two. They used the word high risk vendors, which is basically the sort of the standard term for Huawei, isn't it?
The euphemism.
You don't want to name Huawei.
A bit risky.
Yeah.
A bit dodgy.
So
a bit wave.
It's a risky vendor because we can't possibly call it by name. But they called out that term and said they won 3 deals with tier 1 vendors in the past 3 months, or in the third quarter rather. And that's besides BT, and now have 5 altogether. They're on track to be quite a big player, I think. I mean, they were already a big player in Germany, and I got in touch with.
It's an American company, yeah.
It's an American company, but has like a European presence.
Yeah.
Got in touch with Ronan Kelly, who's the CTO of the European business, and he said, on the record, there's some substance in what you're hearing from the analysts, and we're increasingly being asked to do things like ensure their optical line terminals, which is something that's kind of more within the network, are interoperable with kind of customer premises equipment from other vendors, because the plan is eventually to be able to move across to another supplier, essentially. You've heard the same thing from Nokia. So one of the things you saw in Nokia's results, which we talked about last week, was this massive increase in fixed broadband.
Yeah.
About 30% up, I think, year on year, the sales. I mean, a lot of that's because there's just a lot more fibre being built. That's a boom market, which we're going to talk about in a minute.
Yeah, we will. That's our next segment.
That is obviously driving a lot of it. But I asked on the call with Pekka Lundmark, the CEO, asked him, are you seeing a similar thing going on that happened in mobile, where companies want to move away from Huawei, either because they're fearing restrictions or because governments are telling them to? And he said, yeah. Basically,
right.
there's
Straight
opportunities coming up to. He didn't say he didn't mention Huawei, but he said there's opportunities to swap existing suppliers.
Yeah,
and
they all
Siena's been
it,
saying the same thing about the optical side, which isn't fixed broadband. That's more kind of the transport stuff. But again, that's a market where Huawei's traditionally had a really big presence, and we're seeing Siena as well saying exactly the same things, actually calling Huawei out by name and saying there are opportunities in India. Immediately, because they're very, very keen on getting rid of Huawei, but also in Western Europe over the next few years they're expecting this kind of migration away from it, which is a big opportunity for them. I mean, I think them and Nokia are if you look at optical, they would be the main alternatives, I would think.
Yeah, and I was just looking at Robert Clark's coverage of the Huawei numbers from a week ago on Light Reading, and he's done the currency calculations. And it's saying in that quarter it was about $21 billion.
Yeah.
And the previous quarter it was about $34 billion. So I know this is mainly consumer stuff, but just doing those maths, we've got about $13 billion have got to go to someone else, assuming the market doesn't shrink. If Huawei's not earning it, someone else is.
Yeah.
And so they're still earning. And let's say when all the fallout from consumer stops, and they're, let's say, $15 billion a quarter company, so $60 billion annual. That's a lot of money. If that starts declining, that can go into the hands of other people as well.
I think it'll happen at a slower rate, obviously, because as we said, the replacement cycles. The other thing to point out about fixed broadband is it's quite a small market compared with what's spent on handsets and even what's spent on mobile network equipment. I think mobile network equipment, the best estimate is it's somewhere between, so RAN specifically, radio access network, somewhere between 30 billion and 35 billion annually.
Right.
Omdia's figures at the moment are about 8 billion on fixed access. So it's much, much smaller.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody talks about how costly it is to dig fibre networks, but most of that cost, I think, just goes into getting guys out on the street to clog up Garrett Lane.
Which you and Pierre were bitching about before we started, the people
awful.
laying fibre.
The laying of
cable.
the fibre is the expensive bit. The actual boxes that you get from the companies they're not cheap.
Yeah.
But, 8 billion is still a decent sized market. But if you look at a company like Huawei, so if it has 40% of the market, which I think was what Omdia was saying last year, and it's an 8 billion market, you're good at maths, 3.5 billion, I don't know what it's
3.2.
3.2, yeah. So
do you know what I do for maths? I teach my kids this. When you're doing something like 40%, just do 10% and then multiply by 4.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think everyone does that.
Yeah. Well, except I just did it and you didn't.
So 3.2, and they're still going to get work in China, obviously, and in some other markets. So even if they lose some work, some business, this isn't going to kill them, is it? Losing fixed access work and optical on top of that. I don't know what the size of the optical market is. I haven't got estimates for that one. But you look at what Siena makes and what Nokia make, and what Nokia makes from optical is comparable, I think, to what it makes on fixed access, maybe a little bit less. So, maybe I don't know, maybe a bit. It's nowhere near as big as the RAN market, put it like that. So it's not going to kill them, but it's just another pressure point. And the thing that I wonder is, if they're getting absolutely crucified in handsets, and if the networks business is heading, for a slower decline over the years, they've still got China, which accounts for a massive amount of their sales, doesn't it? What is it, 60%?
Yeah.
I mean,
and the RAN market alone in China is just ridiculous amounts of money.
The RAN market alone is a ridiculous amount of money, and those companies will still buy from Huawei. It's not like consumers, where the consumers go, well, hang on a minute, Huawei's handsets don't support 5G anymore, and there's loads of other Chinese options. We'll go and the Chinese government isn't going to mind because there are loads of Chinese options maybe. in when it comes to the sort of sales to operators for network equipment, they're kind of forced to do that, aren't they? It's what is it the share of that they have of that market? 96%, 95%.
Yeah, generally,
Ericsson and
in the last allocations that we had, once Ericsson's share fell off a cliff, it tended to be about 60% Huawei, 30-odd% ZTE,
yeah,
and then
the rest
and then the
is
long
the
tail. Yeah.
So they have the majority of that market, and that will stay the way it is, I suspect, even with all the problems they've got on the equipment side, and so they'll still have a big business there. But it's you just wonder whether these areas they're talking about, given what I've said about the cloud, and that just seems to be tiny at the moment. They've got server chip problems there, it sounds like.
Right.
You know, if they want to actually build data centers like Amazon does that provide you with cloud services, and not just develop some kind of software that can be used in the public cloud, which is something they could presumably do more easily because they're not going to get hit by US restrictions there. But to actually get those chips is looking like it's a difficult thing to do. And that is very, very subscale cloud business, according to analyst reports. Where's the growth going to come from? I just don't see that these things they're talking about are going to sort of power them to any. They're not going to compensate for what they're losing in other areas.
And they have to say it.
Yeah.
Because the alternative is for them to just go, yeah, we're fucked. It's the Yanks have killed us.
There was a really interesting piece in The Economist, actually. The Schumpeter column. Do you ever read that? It's like the opinion bit at the back of the business section.
I don't normally get that far.
And he was sometimes I just go to it because if it's relevant. But he was talking about what should happen with Huawei.
Dean Bubley would get there on double speed during one of his
walks.
One
of his walks. But the guy who writes Schumpeter was saying that one option is that Huawei just sort of breaks apart, and that all these experts that they've got, with their 100,000 employees or whatever, it's more than that, I think 180,000 employees, many of them involved in R&D, that you could sort of break the company up and use these people to kind of seed other firms and other startups, and maybe this is something that gets orchestrated by the Chinese government even. Again, it wouldn't do their sort of argument that they've got nothing to do with the Chinese government very good.
Well, that was my point when the honour thing went through.
Yeah,
that was my point about the involvement in the state in the thing. It's kind of chicken and egg, because they're forced to make these moves by American sort of commercial aggression and political aggression, but America's big accusation is that the relationship between private enterprise and the state in China is too cozy.
Yeah,
and then the state comes in and bails them out, and is a major stakeholder in this new company that they've done, thus kind of proving the Americans' point. I know they were forced to, but if the way they cope with it is through state intervention, they're kind of proving the Americans' point, aren't they?
Yeah.
Whenever they do that, but then their alternative is just letting the Americans destroy their sort of flagship companies like Huawei, which presumably, I don't think anyone, China or otherwise, would allow that to happen. If hypothetically, the Americans went after a really big British company. Not too many spring to mind, actually. Think of a big British company. I don't know, Vodafone, whatever.
Yeah.
And they went after them and said, Vodafone can't buy our chips or whatever.
Rolls-Royce.
Rolls-Royce. Yeah, let's say Rolls-Royce. And they said, you can't get hold of this component that's needed for the engines that make you one of the biggest engine companies in the world.
Yeah.
You'd think that Bojo would step in, wouldn't you?
Yep.
How would that sound like?
You go, well, less of that.
But this is the trouble with Huawei's argument, that governments always have something to do with companies, yeah?
Yeah,
even
exactly.
in democracies, governments always have some involvement with big companies from that country.
Of course.
And in a totalitarian state like China, even more so, yeah? So it's always been
a matter of degree
it's always
rather
been
than
a flawed
absolute
argument.
I think
really.
it's very flawed. Are you telling me, so there's a couple of things. Obviously, America has got really close relations with defence companies, like sort of Boeing and Raytheon and all those
I mean, the very
sorts of
fact
things.
that there's all this antitrust stuff at the moment about Facebook and the big tech companies shows that governments in the countries where those companies are domiciled can, wield great power over them and attempt to break them up even.
And as I've said lots of times, and sometimes when I mention this, it antagonises my fan base. I think a lot of this antitrust against big tech is born of a desire of the state to have a greater influence.
Yeah.
Especially Facebook. That was the one that really got my trolls worked up. I stand by it. I do think that they're using this woman, Frances Horgan, who let's assume, I don't know what's going on in her head. Let's assume her motives are pure, but she's still being used.
Yeah.
And I think they're being used by US and UK governments as a justification for them imposing more control over Facebook. And the reason they want to impose more control over Facebook isn't to protect us from hate speech or whatever. It's because they think, quite rightly, that Facebook's one of the platforms that has a lot of influence in political outcomes. And that's what freaks them out. That's why we had the Cambridge Analytica storm in a teacup. Cambridge Analytica didn't do anything dodgy at all. All they did was offer like demographic data to political operators in the way that countless other similar companies do. The only thing they did that was dodgy, I think, is to mess around with some of Facebook's data protection rules. But in terms of them, the whole narrative of them influencing elections was bollocks.
Yeah.
But the narrative's out there now that social media, big tech, internet companies influence political outcomes, which is why politicians have such an active interest in it. And I've got one other thing.
Did you hear the Web Summit event in Lisbon? I think it was on Monday. It was like a massive event. They opened with Frances Horgan,
right,
which is usually a completely non-political show.
Yeah.
And then this former investor in Facebook just like called on for like 4 criminal charges on Facebook.
Right.
And then Nick Clegg had to be like, no, we did nothing wrong. Like,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nick Clegg.
Don't you think that we want this to go away as well?
Nick Clegg's presumably not got Frances Horgan on his Christmas card list.
No.
One other just sort of slight tangent, a little story I wrote earlier on this week. Are you familiar with a company called, I think it's NSO Group, who come up with a bit of software called Pegasus? It's basically spyware.
Yeah.
It allows you to sort of hack phones.
Yeah.
And intercept what's going on in them. It's suspected of being used in the assassination of that journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Mm-hmm. Anyway, and they're an Israeli company. I don't know what kind of caveats I need to do, like in terms of covering my arse legally, but I'm not accusing them of anything. I'm just saying this is what's going on. And the Americans have put them on the entity list. So this entity list is sort of metastasizing what seemed to start as just a handy way of victimizing some Chinese companies and by proxy having a sort of a trade war with China. They're now using it for companies from other places, including Israel, which is obviously a strong ally of the US. Now, I don't for one second think this is an attack on Israel.
Yeah.
It would be particularly baffling given that America just shovels money at Israel for it to suddenly start being aggressive towards it. But, I mean, the initial significance of it, and lots of people were celebrating it as a good thing, is America could say that it's opposing the use of spyware, because the accusation is that this Pegasus software is used by countries like Saudi Arabia or wherever for them to then attack dissidents and attack people that the state doesn't like.
Yeah.
And that's good. No one wants a government to be able to hack your phone, spy on what you're doing, illegally gather evidence against you to persecute you and all that sort of thing. But one thing that occurred to me is, back to what made me think of it as my narrative about Frances Horgan. What if they put them on the entity list? What if, let's say, in 6 months' time, they're off the entity list? And you go, okay, how come they're off it? And then you get some kind of press release from the US state going, yeah, they promised to be good from now on, so we've taken them off the entity list. Well, what concession do you think this company will have had to make to the US state in order to get off the entity list? Maybe to give them access to this software so that they can spy on people in sort of Edward Snowden-y sort of way.
Yeah.
I don't have any evidence for that. It's just a theory. But if they get off the entity list, I think it's perfectly legitimate to ask what they did.
Yeah, unless it's
to suddenly get in the US state's good books.
If it's not explained.
Yeah.
I mean, we know why ZTE came off the entity list, because it paid massive fines and agreed to replace managers and be supervised by the US for several years, and therefore it came off the entity list.
Yeah.
But that was very much in the public eye. But if it's not explained, then those questions are going to get asked.
So that's the broader thing. I'm going to move it on to the next segment, but that's just a broader part of governments using legislation, regulation, antitrust, that sort of thing, as a stick to beat companies with. Is one that's really worth keeping an eye on. Did Pierre just hand you a pink Camden Pale?
It's very cold as well. It feels
Very
like being
cold.
outside again.
So that pink Camden Pale is about 6%, isn't it?
No.
Look on the side.
5.8, okay. Yeah.
5.8, there we go. Thank you very much.
I thought it was more like 5.4.
I thought it was over 6, actually. But there we go. Right, I'm going to move it on. Fibre. So we've touched on this already.
It's good for roughage.
Yeah, it keeps you regular. Mary...
Wow.
Sorry.
I've really got to find a way of getting sort of keeps you regular in a fibre headline at some stage in the future. Mary sort of covering quarterlies for us yesterday, sort of grouped together a few UK fibre stories. Basically, BT. I mean, the long and short of it, I'm not going to go through the story. She did a great job, a nice long story. But basically, everyone's talking about fibre. It seems BT, Virgin Media, O2, in their quarterly. City Fibre's just hit some kind of million milestone of rolling it out to presumably that's a million premises. We've got other little stories, like one I looked at today. Deutsche Telekom has got into a joint venture with a private equity, an investment company, to form a new rural fibre company in Germany. So I guess the talking point about this is that we seem to be at a sort of exponential phase of fibre rollout, fibre investment, and all that sort of thing. Is that, Ian, how you perhaps when you were looking at your Huawei Europe stories, is that how you see the...
So we could see it on the streets where we live.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
I mean, there's a massive amount of money going into fibre, basically, and you can see that on Omdia's forecast. That's just what I was looking up, by the way. I was
Okay.
like faffing around with my phone. I was listening to you.
I know that's a
but-
bit why I was umming and ahhing. I was like, can I hand the ball to Ian? Or
I
is
mean,
he
so
too busy?
Omdia's forecast, if you look at fibre spending in 2019, it actually went down last year. I mean, maybe not surprising, year of the pandemic, a lot of things sort of
Right.
took a back seat, but I think it's been quite flattish. I'm showing a picture now. It's going
Right.
like that. So you had 8 billion. I said the market was 8 billion, yeah? Their forecast is that by 2025, that'll be a $14 billion
Right,
dollar
it's
market.
almost double.
Right? So if you're thinking of somewhere to put money at the moment, and this is, you can see this already in Nokia's numbers, as I say, 29% up. Maybe they're taking a lot of business that Huawei once had,
Yeah.
which isn't actually growing the market. We'd have to know what's happening with other companies, but there's a huge amount of spending going into fibre networks, and a lot of it's come from just, I hate to use that expression, the new normal, but it's true. People having, during the pandemic, people having gone and spent time working in their homes,
Yeah, Zoom calls and all
Zoom
that.
calls, education, and the applications themselves are just demanding more and more bandwidth, basically.
And of course, everyone's got Netflix and or Amazon Prime and or whatever.
And it was a case, years ago. I think we talked about this when we were all in Amsterdam. That years ago, you struggled to find operators that would justify the case for investing in fibre. They were all sort of trying to sweat their copper assets, and this is good enough, and it was hard to attract interest from investors. And it's almost the other way around now. I remember Daryl at Omdia talking, not Daryl, sorry.
Dario,
not Daryl. Daryl's left. Dario, who we had on the podcast in Amsterdam, we're talking about the fact that there's like a pool of investors now just chasing fibre. That it's almost like there's more private equity companies interested in fibre than there are companies building fibre, and you can see that in the UK with, as Pierre was saying earlier. I was just walking to the train station earlier today. The streets are all being dug up by a company called G Network. That's one of there's dozens now.
And
it
I'd
seems,
never
in
heard
the
of
UK. Exactly.
I
You used
never
to
heard
think
of them, and I
about
made it
City
to
Fibre
Telecoms.com.
and Hyperoptic maybe, and a couple of others, and now there's dozens of these companies. Apparently Adtran this is another thing that came out on their call. They're involved in about half of the altnet builds in the UK market. Adtran's involved in. It's probably not surprising, because if you're not going to use Huawei, and why would you if you're just starting a greenfield project? There's no way you would, It's who's it going to be? Nokia, Adtran, Calix maybe. I mean, I don't know how big they are in Europe. That's the thing. I know they've got a US presence, but you're not really got that many options. So it's a great time to be, at one of those companies.
So one thing I don't get, fiber's been around for a while. Light reading gets its name from fiber.
Well, it's optical, I think, really.
Right. Well, isn't that more or less the same thing?
Well, light, photonics and stuff isn't necessarily like.
Well, I suppose you could have beams and lasers and stuff.
Yeah.
But generally, in the telecoms environment, when we're talking about sort of optical, we're talking about it normally going over fibre. I thought maybe I'm just revealing a degree of ignorance /
I think
naivety.
the light reading started off to sort of covering optical components and things like that. And,
all right.
Do you want me to text Steve to ask?
Yeah.
And
interrupt. You can interrupt one of his rehearsals.
There's stuff going on there as well. I mean, that is quite a hot market.
Well, anyway, the reason I bring it up and immediately exposing myself by trying to talk authoritatively on something that I'm fairly ignorant about in the concept of telecoms, but it's been around for a while. We've been talking about fibre for a while.
Yeah.
Light reading's been around 20 odd years, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Why are we getting this sort of exponential growth phase now, as opposed to 10 years, 5 years, 20 years ago?
Well, I guess the applications weren't there 5, 10, 20 years ago, and the usage patterns were different. So I think the pandemic's obviously traffic growth in the pandemic isn't to be underestimated, and I think that in itself's generated a lot of the demand for fibre investment that's coming at the moment. So I think that's one big factor, and I think the other one is just it's not just happened in fixed; it's happened in mobile as well. You look at consumption on a phone, on a smartphone, what it was 10 years ago. How many megabytes were people using a month? Probably not that many, actually. And now what they're using, I mean, it's not unusual to go through tens of gigabytes, is it, in a month? Actually,
not unusual at all.
If you're someone who watches a lot of films on your phone and does gaming and all that sort of stuff, and I think the same thing's happened in I thought Ronan Kelly of Adtran, who I mentioned earlier, gave a really good presentation in Amsterdam about average households and what goes on in them now.
Yeah.
And he was talking about his own house. So he's got 2 teenagers. I think might be
Who
saying
like
this
to
on a
play Fortnite
podcast
or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, he said it publicly.
Yeah. And he's got it's a family with two teenagers doing gaming. They've got a couple of 4K TVs in the house. And he was saying it's not unusual for it to be, it's tens of gigabytes a month. It's more than tens of gigabytes. It's going up to over 100.
Fixed. Yeah.
Fixed now. I mean, I remember a few years ago when I was on a usage platform on BT's network, so 6-7 years ago, when we just got our first fibre package.
What, and it was metered?
It was metered then.
Right.
We were capped at 30 or 40 gigabytes a month. And then I went over that a couple of times because I think we streamed some films.
Yeah.
Remember, 7 years ago is before things like Netflix and Amazon were
so a typical household's
being
probably
used
doing
on smart TVs.
I don't know. There's probably data. I don't even know if Ronan mentioned it, but a typical household's probably doing about 100 gig a month or something.
I wonder how much.
I think it's 160 was the figure he gave.
Right.
Really?
But he said that was pulled down by the fact that you get a lot of older households who don't use much at all.
Right.
So if you actually look at people with teenage kids, it could be even higher. But think about how many homes now have smart TVs and how many had them. Were smart TVs even around 7 years ago? I don't know. When was the first smart TV sold, commercialised?
Around there, yeah.
So that in itself, I think, is a huge difference. I mean, we don't watch any TV at the moment that isn't through the internet. We don't tend to watch any sort of broadcast stuff at all.
I don't pay for a license.
I don't pay for a license either.
Oh my God!
No, I don't.
I don't either. We don't watch BBC. We don't have the app. We don't use it.
Can you prove that you never watch BBC?
Well, we phoned up specifically to say, can you do that? And they said, as long as you don't have the app downloaded and you're not doing anything like that, you don't have to pay it.
Fair enough.
So, and all we ever watch is.
So you two don't pay a TV license? I feel like such a mug. I do.
So all we have is Netflix, Amazon, Disney, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's all our viewing is on those. And we'll just stick something on in the evening, a series that we want to watch or whatever it might be.
Watch a lot of YouTube on TV.
Or a film.
Actually.
Yeah. The kids watch a lot of YouTube, actually, as well.
Yeah.
I wonder.
I can confirm that.
What happens if you watch like a Graham Norton clip on YouTube? Does that count as the BBC?
Well, that's it. Or you go onto the BBC Sport website or something like that. I mean, does that count? Or is it only if you watch a clip from Match of the Day on the BBC? Well, I don't know. But, if you two can... I mean, I don't believe... This is a complete tangent. I don't believe in the license fee because I think it's a form of taxation that doesn't go through normal democratic channels. But I'm conflicted. Like my dad, for example, is really hostile to it. But I'm conflicted because there's so much content I've really enjoyed on the BBC over the year. I mean, all the not all, but most of the best comedy from my childhood, like Young Ones, Blackadder, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, going back to Fawlty Towers, whatever.
Well,
I stopped paying when they fired Jeremy Clarkson. Actually,
but they have things like Fawlty Towers on Netflix now, and you know you can watch it on that.
No, but the reason I'm conflicted about the license fee is, would the Young Ones have been made if it wasn't for the novel funding model that the BBC has? Would ITV have made the Young Ones? I don't know. Maybe they would. I mean, there is other good stuff. I think Red Dwarf was an ITV
I think that
thing.
the trouble is that in the current climate, I probably couldn't see it being made at all by the BBC. I think the BBC 20,
Not
30,
in the current climate.
BBC 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago is very different from the BBC now. The BBC now is just this sort of lead woke campaigner, it seems, that won't do anything unless it ticks a lot of boxes. So.
Do you know now there's a Mila Kunis? You know Mila Kunis?
Yeah.
She has a show that's funded with NFTs.
Wow.
Yeah. So basically, fans of the show pick where they want the story to go by buying NFTs. I think that's more or less what the thing is. Yeah, I felt like such an old person when I heard this.
So that gets into a sort of blockchain-y type of thing.
Yeah,
that's almost like role-playing games, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where you turn to page 50 if you want your character to.
Oh, you've just
walk to
reminded
the back
me.
Of the cave
I should say it now on the podcast in case I forget. I was thinking, like, sometimes people ask me, what's your next book going to be? And I haven't got any ideas.
Yeah.
It took me 10 fucking years to write this one. But it suddenly occurred to me it might be quite fun. Me and my mate Gareth, we've known each other since secondary school, and we first met because we used to buy those books
when I was that age.
Yeah. Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, I think it was.
There was Lone Wolf was one series I remember.
I think the very first one was called Warlock of something Mountain.
I haven't watched the Black Mirror movie like this on.
I remember that one.
Well,
I had the same book, the Warlock thing.
Higher Top Mountain.
Yeah, that's it.
Like that.
Wow.
Anyway,
have you watched the Black Mirror movie? Is it good?
That one where you supposedly
that's
have
that model. That's the model of that movie, isn't it? You choose what's going to happen. I haven't watched it. I should do.
It's a bit of a shit effort. There aren't that many choices.
Oh, but you have tried it?
Well, I watched that episode, but it wasn't very interactive.
I thought it was a movie.
I thought they did a movie as well that was based on that concept where you basically decide what to do. And Bear Grylls has done this actually on one of his sort of survival shows where there's a Bear Grylls series that he did for Netflix where you get to pick, should he go down the canal or should he climb up the mountain? And should he eat this food or should he eat that food? And if you pick the wrong choice, sometimes he eats something that kills him, you know. And,
so my idea for a book,
or he gets ill and he's like, I'm going to have to stop doing this now. And
so my idea for a book, because what interests me, as a writer, if I'm not writing about telecoms, is sort of humanities, politics, economics, psychology, ethics, all that sort of stuff. I thought, wouldn't it be cool to write a book where you've got whatever narrative you've got, but you're forced to make sort of, let's say, ethical choices.
Yeah.
And then you could have some quite fun going down rabbit holes of what the consequences of those ethical choices are. So you heard it first here, folks. Hang around for another 10 years
Pre-order
and I
now.
might actually write it.
When you're 60, we can come back here and celebrate.
Right.
But we should go back onto fibre.
Yes. Well, and we're going to run out of time soon, but we got time to sort of do any other fibre. Have you got any other sort of fibre
I
thoughts?
thought BT's update was interesting this week, and presumably that was one of the things that Mary sort of pulled into
that's
her
what
little...
she led on.
So they had this earnings update that was really well received by the markets. I think their share price was up quite a bit, maybe 5%. I mean, it's still well down on what it was, obviously, a few years ago, after all the sort of issues they've had. But
I think I sold my tenner of BT.
The guy who's...
One of 20p, I think.
Yeah, the guy who's heading it now, Philip Janssen, has obviously done quite a good job, I think, just on basic cost control. And it's quite interesting how they've moved away from all the stuff they were trying to do under Gavin Patterson, his predecessor. He was a very sort of flamboyant figure, shirt unbuttoned to the waist, locks flowing like David Hasselhoff. And he was very much about sport and let's spend loads of money on TV license rights for just so we can watch Liverpool.
He probably just did it because he quite fancies going to the footy.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, they're all into it for that reason, aren't they? I mean, that's why these billionaires buy football clubs. They're just big kids, basically. But this guy, Philip Janssen, is obviously much more focused on trying to make it an infrastructure company and realises, I think, that, I mean, they came under a lot of pressure from Ofcom, didn't they, over the years to do more about funding high-speed networks. And then we've had all these companies coming along like City Fibre, now G Network, Hyperoptic, whoever it might be. Virgin Media is the big one, obviously, funding infrastructure. BT needs to move, otherwise it's going to be left behind, It won't even be a case of the regulator leaning on it. It will just be
just get overtaken.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is they've gone from this position where they looked sort of in danger a little bit, I think, at one stage in terms of what could happen with their market share, I get, in this sort of fibre era potentially, to being quite confident and really upbeat about winning the game. I mean, he almost said, we don't know what the score is going to be. He's talking about market share. We don't know what the score is going to be, but we know we're going to win.
Right.
And well, they're rolling out a lot more quickly than anybody else. This is the thing. They're on 6 million households. I mean, you were talking about how bad the UK looks next to other European countries on full fibre rollout. Yeah, but look at the improvement over the last year. They're rolling out more quickly than any other operator in Europe, BT, full fibre. That is something they've done really, really well. Take-up's another matter. But they've now got this deal with Ofcom where they're allowed to price fibre at the price they want, to make a decent return on it.
I see.
Which was a critical thing because that's something they'd always been.
When was that?
That was done within the last year, that deal. I mean, that would always been one of the sticking points of BT, unless they get the right regulatory framework and they're allowed
what's the incentive for us?
Then what's the incentive? And that'd been a sticking point for years and years and years. But, Ofcom's basically given them a lot of pricing freedom, and they've now got these big...
And Ofcom can do it for the reasons we just detailed, because they're not a monopoly anymore. So,
this is the thing.
Ofcom would have been much more hesitant to give them a free rein.
There's infrastructure-based competition, but is there enough infrastructure-based competition to derail BT and mean that it's not the dominant player? I don't know, and that's sort of
So it still must have multiples of the number of premises.
Well, they're doing 25 million by 2026 is their goal. I mean, I think the next, Virgin Media's got this big plan. They'd be the next biggest one, but they don't cover the whole country. They're 60% of households, 70%, I think. There's a big gap there. And then you go down to City Fibre, where I think their ambition was 5 million premises or something. It's much, much less.
And they've just hit 1 million.
They've just hit 1 million. Yeah. So it's a big difference. And they've now got these retailers that use their service, the kind of wholesale service, the people that buy stuff off OpenReach, signed up to these deals, long-term deals with Sky, TalkTalk, the big guys in the broadband retail market, kind of locked in over a period of years to resell the BT service. I just think things, and the other thing that was interesting about them, this is one of the reasons why they're forecasting a kind of big improvement in free cash flow and a fall in costs over the years, is they now reckon they've managed to reduce the cost of build out from previously they were sort of saying about 300 quid a home down to 250. It's a big difference if you add that all up over lots of households. And he got asked about this on the call, Philip Jansen. Do you think that's a competitive advantage versus other fibre builders? Have you done it, and could other fibre builders achieve the same thing? And he's basically, it is a competitive advantage because it gives them a pricing advantage, doesn't it? Or it gives them a profit advantage. And he was saying that the reason they've been able to do it is just the scale they've got. The whole economies of scale argument. You're targeting 25 million premises. You've got 6 million covered. It's going to be a really hard thing for other companies to match that. And this is one thing I'm going to do next week is reach out to people like City Fibre and ask them what they think about that. What are their build-out costs per home, and how important is that? But they're looking. There's still a lot of questions about BT. I'm not saying it's all great for them, but certainly in terms of fibre and what's happening in that market and how well they're doing on the build out, I think there's reasons to be kind of optimistic about them. Yeah,
and then just to wrap up, the sector on the whole, you can see why private equity and investment money is keen on it as part of a portfolio, because it's basically a guaranteed.
It's long-term guaranteed returns. Yeah.
It's like putting money in in sort of sovereign bonds or something like that. You just know it's safe. It's not like people are going to stop using,
and more so than ever now.
Yeah,
more so than ever.
And then to answer my own question about why it's in the exponential phase, and you talked about general usage and then mobile usage, and obviously for 5G you need the backhaul, which is fibre.
We haven't talked about, but that's really important actually.
So there's just no risk attached to it. The only risk attached to it is whether or not you get an adequate return on your investment, but there's no risk of you losing your money.
Yeah.
At the very least, you've just got this asset that's going to be used forever, a lot. It's not, I always find one of the reasons Telecoms.com covers mobile more is I just find it more interesting myself. And I'm the editor, so there we go.
Yeah.
But fibre.
Fiber's where the excitement is really, it's where the money is at the moment.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, 5G's been really disappointing. Let's be honest.
Yeah,
Pretty well.
well,
I mean,
as we
all the
covered
stuff
with
we
Dean
had with
last
Dean,
week,
it probably
yeah.
continue to be so, I suspect. Whereas fiber is connected with 5G. Actually, it's part of the 5G story, and it's its own story, in its own right. So,
Actually, I've got one quick thing I want to cover before we move on to the final segment. I did a webinar with Qualcomm earlier on this week. It's a commercial thing. I wouldn't normally bring it up on here.
Yeah.
But the subject matter was millimeter wave. And, and I even said on the, because they got me quite involved, it was like a to and fro. It wasn't just me topping and tailing it and doing the Q&A. And I said on the podcast, we often joke that the only way millimeter works is if you're sat on top of a base station.
yeah.
And obviously, given that it was a commercial thing, I then went, that's not really the case. That's just a joke. But the guys, the two Qualcomm guys presenting, did do a good job of adding to my understanding of the nuance of millimeter wave and basically how it enters into the mix. So the difference between 5G on a lot of levels and previous generations is you've got these three sort of bands. In fact, we're going to get into the middle band in a sec. You've got these three bands. You've got the traditional band, which we've used forever, which has got a great range and propagation characteristics. You got, and then as you go up frequencies, you get poorer propagation characteristics, but you get more of it, so you can have a fatter pipe.
Yeah.
And millimeter wave is at the top end of that. So it's got the most rubbish propagation characteristics, but there's loads of it. And so it's just into the mix in really sort of dense, like stadiums, shopping malls, big transport hubs, all that sort of thing. And it just reminded me that while we'll continue to be skeptical about millimeter wave until it proves itself as a viable sort of commercial component of the mix, I do have to say that Qualcomm did a decent job of reminding me that there is a place for it.
Yeah.
It's just quite specific. Mm-hmm. No one's ever going to be using millimeter wave to just use their mobile phone under normal circumstances. But in really sort of dense usage areas, it does have a place. Anyway, I'm gonna stop there because we're running out of time. So yes, talking about the middle band, we call it more broadly mid band, but in the States they've got a bit of mid band that they call C band. I honestly lose track of all these fucking bands, if I'm honest. It's like listening to a radio station, band of the week, and they did an auction of this C band, which is about 3.7 gigahertz to about 4.2 gigahertz, so a classic mid-band kind of spectrum. They did an auction of this C-band at the start of the year and rinsed American operators for about $81 billion.
Yeah. Quite a lot of money.
Quite a lot of money, but, as ever, they think it's worth it because mid-band's a big part of the 5G mix. Yeah, that's where you get...
They think it's worth it because the US government certainly thinks it's worth it because they need some money.
Oh yeah, well, don't get me started. We don't have time for me to rant about who is it for governments to charge.
I mean, it's probably better than it is in Europe because I think their licenses just last forever, don't they? In the US, it's not like they renew them.
Do you know? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big differences between the US and Europe.
Is they're about 10-year licenses here, aren't they?
And they're just a license that you permanently have. Whereas they run out after 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, and then you have
to pay it.
Then
for
you
it
get
again,
to go back into the piggy bank again.
Yeah.
But anyway, the reason I'm bringing it up is not to moan on behalf of AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile, and I wouldn't on their behalf. But of course, those costs get passed on to consumers, so it is basically a form of tax, as far as I'm concerned. These license fees. Yeah. Is that there was just a little thing? I think it's a Wall Street Journal piece that went out yesterday. I covered it this morning. Light Reading covered it yesterday. That AT&T and Verizon are delaying their rollout of 5G services over the C-band spectrum that they bought at the start of the year. Because apparently the American aviation regulator, the FAA, is worried that it mucks about with airline safety systems, which are over that spectrum. I think they're at the upper end. I think they're at about 4.2 or something like that. Yeah. Some safety systems. And the reason I bring it up is, obviously if it does, then you need to look into it. But what were they doing? Auctioning this stuff raking in $81 billion when there was a possibility of this being an issue. It's absolutely remarkable. And then in the 9-10 months since then, why hasn't it come up? Why is it only now, in early November, when they were about to roll it out in a month's time, that they're having to delay it? So there's just kind of
I think
smell of rat. It's all a bit weird.
The FAA is just trying it on, isn't it, I think?
Well, tell me, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I don't know much about it because it's a sort of thing.
No, but you've been doing a little bit of reading up.
I did. Well, there's so one of the analysts we use, Strank and Salt, we mentioned them a few times, and a lady at that company called Rosalind Layton, who is American and covers US things to some extent. I mean, she had a really interesting note on it that she sent me. I might as well just read out what she said because I haven't had a chance to write it.
Hopefully she won't mind.
But she basically
sue us for copyright.
She'd be very happy to be called out. No, she said the things that you were saying, and then she goes on and basically said, at the 11th hour, the Federal Aviation Administration issued an advisory that 5G transmissions could interfere with altimeters in nearby bands. It does not have specific evidence that this is a problem, but it refers to tests conducted in worst-case scenarios. These tests were later discredited as being unrealistic and unreliable. The FAA has asked aviators to submit data which it will forward to the FCC. It is also warning of substantial risk of loss of life and property. And then she goes on to say, on the one hand, we can see that the FAA is risk averse, so it would prefer to have no 5G at all. On the other hand, it's likely that there are millions of old and defunct altimeters installed which could malfunction for any reason at all. The FAA does not want to check for these or to ask all aviators to upgrade their equipment. It's a far smarter strategy to blame it all on 5G.
I see.
And that, to me,
now I
don't know
rings true.
I don't know the ramifications, but looking at the way things have happened, as you just said, this has been a long, drawn-out process. Why is this all of a sudden coming up now? And you say you smell a rat. Well, that really would sort of explain to some extent what's going on, wouldn't it?
I think there's some aggro between the FCC and the FAA.
Yeah,
FCC obviously.
But it's funny because it's pretty disastrous, isn't it, if you're an operator, if this is going to slow things down? I mean, if you've built into your business plan that you need... We talked about millimetre wave and how rubbish it is. And despite, Qualcomm's, enthusiasm and Nokia's getting excited about it, let's be honest, it's still rubbish. Yeah. It's still a pretty useless technology in terms of providing wide area coverage.
Yeah. I don't think even Qualcomm would deny that.
And the mid-band spectrum, which they've been rolling out actually not rolling out that quickly according to some stakeholders, but rolling out in Europe and other parts of the world, is the sweet spot for 5G. Yeah, you get the coverage to some extent. Okay, it's not exactly what you get on your 2G, 3G grid. You might have to put more equipment in. You might have to take advantage of more efficient technologies to be able to cover the same kind of area. But you get that combination of coverage and high speed. It's a sort of sweet spot between the two. You go too low down, and you're getting a basically not much better than a 4G service. In fact, it might even be worse than 4G in terms of capability.
Just isn't there. And you're using little 5 megahertz
and you go
chunks.
too high up, and you end up with, like you said, you need to sit on top of a base station.
Mm-hmm.
So mid-band spectrum is the real valuable
supposed to be
stuff.
the best of both worlds.
And for the big operators in America to all of a sudden be told they have to delay their rollout while this ridiculous issue gets investigated that should have been dealt with months, if not years ago, it's outrageous. I mean, how much could this potentially cost them, do you think, in terms of...
Well, it depends. If it's just a month, I mean, the Wall Street Journal thing attempted to answer that question. I think they sort of interviewed some experts, and they said if it's just a month delay, it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Because this stuff is
a month will be fine.
Yeah. But the thing about it, and I think it's affected their share price. This story. The thing about it is obviously if you're an investor or if you're an equity analyst, you're thinking, well, is it just going to be a month, or are we going to get to the end? Are we going to get to the start of next year and they delay it again and again and again? Anytime you introduce one delay, you create the prospect of other delays.
I find it hard to believe that something like that, where a major organisation like the FAA has come along and said this interferes with altimeters or whatever, would be resolved in 4 or 5 weeks, knowing how legal things play out.
And knowing that they haven't been able to resolve it up until now.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I think that month feels like an odd little bit on the end. I mean, from the point of view of the operators, obviously they've got to do it, because let's say if there's even a 1% chance that there's something in this, and then a plane falls out of the sky, or crashes into a mountain because its altimeter's fucked up.
Yeah.
and they can be held culpable, because this is what it comes down to, is culpability, isn't it?
Yeah.
And they can be held culpable for not delaying it, then they're obviously in all sorts of trouble.
Exactly. So it's the sort of thing that anybody who's on the regulatory side who doesn't quite know the science and the details is just going to go, hang on a minute, this needs to be thoroughly investigated.
We've just had 18 months of the most profound risk aversion injected into our culture. So, everyone's kind of heading that way instinctively anyway.
Exactly.
But, these bans, they're being used in Europe.
Yeah.
And no planes have fallen out of the sky or even had a bit of a nightmare, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah, I don't know the details of what bans European airspace uses or whatever for. You get into all sorts of complicated things here about which spectrum's been awarded for which particular technology or service in which part of the world, and it does vary a lot, doesn't it? But there is some kind of...
And our mid-band's a bit more 3.5 rather than 4.
It is, but there is supposed to be some kind of harmonisation. That's why they have these world conferences, isn't it, on the use of spectrum, and it's not just about telecom, it's about spectrum that get used for other applications as well. So, yeah, it seems odd that it would be a US issue and not an issue anywhere else at all, but... I think it's a fascinating story, though. It's not one I've tracked, but
no, it kind of came out of the blue, and I just spotted it today. I might not have covered it, but I'm pleased I did, because in summary, and we'll have to wrap it up soon, because I'm going to be a good boy. I'm going to end it bang on 3:30 like you wanted, Pierre. I'm so disciplined. Is that so the 1 month delay? All right. Not the end of the world. If it was a 1 month delay just because I couldn't be bothered or whatever, no one would think twice about it.
Yeah.
But it's because it's created a new thing that, to the best of my knowledge, no one was talking about before. Have you ever encountered this? So I've never heard of...
the last thing I heard of was, the big issue with 5G spectrum being allocated in the US for a long time, and why mid-band hadn't been awarded quicker, was to do with satellite interference. That was the thing.
Yeah.
Because it was stuff that was being used by satellite.
And C-band was a satellite thing, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think. And then in other parts of the world, like Russia, for instance, I think the mid-band spectrum has been used by the military. So they've had to clear it and I think it might not even have been clear. They're talking even about using slightly different spectrum over there. I don't quite know what the situation is at the moment, but there are always issues with spectrum's a finite thing, so if you take a band, there's a good chance that it's being used for something. And
you can't have people
into that.
You can't have people using mobile phones over a band that you use to remote control a drone or something like
completely.
that. Yeah. Okay, look, we better wrap it up there. But it's going to be interesting. Even if it just goes away, that's a story.
Yeah.
Like, why did it come up? Why did it go away? Is this just some stupid little bit of saber rattling between two federal agencies in the US?
Yeah.
But it's worth us making a mental note to keep an eye on it, because however it progresses, it should be an interesting story. Cool. Right, there we are. 3:29, Pierre. So I'll wrap up now. I will say thank you very much for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.